November 2003, Tumwater, Washington. Listen. You hear that? Nothing. For the first time in 107 years, the Olympia Brewery is silent. No conveyor belts grinding, no boilers hissing steam, no bottles clinking down production lines. Just silence. But here's what makes this silence unbearable. The water is still flowing. Right outside the factory walls, Tumwater Falls thunders over basalt rock, just like it has for 10,000 years. The same glacial water that made Olympia beer legendary, the same water that built an entire town, the same water that guaranteed 3 generations of workers a future. Still flowing. But inside the factory? Dead. This wasn't a bankruptcy. This wasn't a market collapse. Olympia beer never stopped selling. The brand is still on shelves right now. You can buy it in 47 states. So how does a brewery that never failed at making beer lose everything that made it matter? How does a 107-year-old institution, the industrial heart of an entire town, get shut down in a single corporate decision? How does "it's the water" become a lie? Before there were labels, before there were slogans, before there was Olympia beer, there was water. The falls that changed everything. Tumwater Falls, Washington. The Deschutes River drops sharply over ancient basalt rock, creating natural power, clean flow, and a constant supply of cold, mineral-rich water. For thousands of years, indigenous communities fished here. For early settlers in the 1890s, this was industrial gold waiting to be claimed. 1896. 3 men looked at those falls and saw opportunity, not just water, beer water. They founded what would become the Olympia Brewing Company. The choice of location wasn't random, it was destiny written in geology. At the end of the 19th century, beer was still hyper-local. Refrigeration was primitive. Long-distance transport was unreliable. Breweries survived by staying close to their water source. Tumwater offered both the water and the market. Glacial water filtered naturally through volcanic rock. A growing population of loggers, mill workers, railroad crews. From day one, Olympia was built as a working brewery, not a monument. The early plant was modest but efficient, designed to harness gravity flow and river proximity. The goal was simple: brew consistent beer for the region, year after year, using the water that made it possible. The town and the brewery became one. By the early 1900s, the brewery was Tumwater's largest employer. Workers lived within walking distance. Shifts were structured around the rhythms of production. Production was structured around the falls. The brewery and Tumwater grew together, each dependent on the other. When the brewery expanded, the town expanded. When the brewery slowed, the town felt it immediately. This wasn't just employment, this was symbiosis. 1916. Washington State bans alcohol, 4 years before the rest of the country. For most breweries, this was a death sentence. Hundreds closed permanently. Olympia survived by retreating rather than collapsing. The strategy: hibernate, don't die. The company shifted to producing near beer, non-alcoholic, soft drinks, malt syrup, legally for baking purposes, wink wink, operating just enough to keep the plant alive, the workforce partially intact, and the connection to the water unbroken. 1933, national prohibition ends. While competitors scrambled to rebuild from scratch, Olympia was ready. experienced workers, functioning infrastructure, the falls still flowing. That continuity mattered. Olympia didn't need to reinvent itself. It simply resumed what it had always done, brewing beer where the water was best.
World War II, the accelerator. As the nation mobilized, demand for beer rose sharply. Workers poured into shipyards, lumber mills, defense plants across Washington and Oregon. Olympia supplied them. Production increased, shifts expanded. The Tumwater plant ran at near constant capacity. Beer from Tumwater became part of wartime routine, consumed in union halls, taverns, and homes at the end of exhausting shifts. Post-war, the true golden age. The late 1940s and 1950s marked Olympia's peak. The Tumwater Brewery expanded. Modernized brewing vessels, new bottling lines, expanded storage facilities, all while remaining rooted to the same water source.
Employment grew into the hundreds. Fathers training sons, neighbors sharing shifts, whole blocks tied to the same payroll. In Tumwater, the brewery wasn't just an employer, it was the economic spine of the town. The slogan that wasn't marketing, it was truth. During these years, Olympia became one of the most recognizable regional beers west of the Rockies. Distribution stretched across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Alaska. Yet even at its height, Olympia never attempted to compete directly with national giants. Instead, Olympia doubled down on what made it different. That difference was distilled into 3 words. It's the water. This wasn't a marketing invention. It was a statement of geological fact. The brewery's water was drawn directly from artesian wells fed by the same glacial system that powered Tumwater Falls. Naturally cold, low in impurities, ideally suited for brewing lighter lagers. In an era before widespread water treatment, this mattered. Brewers elsewhere had to engineer consistency. Olympia inherited it from the land. Advertising philosophy, honest beer from a real place. Advertising from the 1950s and early 1960s reflected this. Pacific Northwest landscapes, snow-capped mountains, flowing water. Olympia was positioned not as a party beer, a status symbol, but as a dependable companion to working life. To drink Olympia was to drink something local, honest, and familiar. Inside the plant, cautious modernization. Production reflected the same values. New equipment was integrated into existing workflows, not replacing them wholesale. Quality control remained linked to experienced workers, not automated systems alone. The goal was never maximum output at any cost. The goal was consistency. Olympia didn't need to flood the market. It needed to remain trusted.
By the early 1960s, Olympia stood as one of the most successful regional beer producers in the United States. Financially stable, deeply embedded in its community, secure in its identity. From leadership's perspective, everything was working exactly as it should. But the industry was already shifting. While Olympia felt secure, the rules of American brewing were being rewritten. Technological changes. Refrigerated trucking removed distance as a constraint. Pasteurization extended shelf life. Water treatment meant breweries no longer needed exceptional natural sources. Chemistry replaced geography. Flavor could be standardized anywhere.
What had once been Olympia's greatest advantage, the water, was becoming irrelevant. The marketing revolution. National brewers rewrote how beer was sold. Television advertising transformed beer from a regional product into a national lifestyle brand. Budweiser, Miller, and Coors flooded American living rooms with sports, leisure, belonging that had nothing to do with place. Their message was simple. It doesn't matter where beer comes from. It matters that it's everywhere. Olympia did not follow. Its marketing remained restrained, almost stubbornly so. The brewery continued to emphasize origin, quality, regional identity. To longtime customers, this felt authentic. To younger drinkers growing up under national advertising campaigns, Olympia became increasingly invisible.
Inside the company, dangerous comfort. Leadership interpreted the numbers cautiously and incorrectly. Olympia was still profitable. Market share in the Northwest remained respectable. From an internal perspective, there was no emergency. The brewery had survived prohibition, after all. It had weathered wars and economic downturns. There was a quiet confidence it would weather this, too. But something critical had shifted. Long-term decisions began to stall. Expansion plans discussed, then deferred. Investment became conservative, focused on maintaining existing operations rather than preparing for a transformed industry. The brewery was no longer being built for the future. It was preserved for the present. The trap of being different. This pattern repeated across the country. Hundreds of regional breweries vanished during the 1960s and 1970s, either swallowed by larger competitors or forced to close. Olympia saw this happening. It watched familiar names disappear. And yet there was a persistent belief that Olympia was different, that its history insulated it, that its water protected it, that loyalty would save it. That belief wasn't arrogance.
It was habit. For decades, Olympia had been rewarded for restraint. It grew carefully. It avoided debt-driven expansion. It stayed rooted to Tumwater. Those choices had once made it resilient. Now they made it slow. While competitors centralized production, slashed costs, scaled infinitely, Olympia remained tied to a single labor-intensive plant, a specific water source, a town that couldn't be replicated. On the factory floor, the change was felt before it was understood. Workers noticed upgrades slowed. Equipment was repaired rather than replaced. Conversations about the future became vague. Management language shifted subtly, from confidence to caution, from growth to options. No one said the brewery was in danger, but no one promised permanence either.
A factory can appear healthy long after it has stopped being protected. By the late 1970s, Olympia occupied a shrinking space, too large to reinvent itself as a niche producer, too small to compete as a national giant. Its costs were higher than centralized mega-breweries. Its identity was tied to a place the industry no longer valued. The brewery had not failed, but it was being outgrown by a system that no longer needed what it offered. 1983. Olympia Brewing Company is sold. Publicly, the language was reassuring. Strategic partnership, provides capital, expands distribution, protects the brand. Employees were told the brewery will continue operating. Consumers were told nothing will change. On paper, the transaction looked like preservation. In reality, it marked the end of local control. For the first time since the 19th century, Olympia's fate was no longer decided in Tumwater. Decisions were now filtered through a corporate logic that did not recognize the brewery's history as value. The plant was no longer the company. It was an asset, one production site among many, evaluated by cost per barrel, labor efficiency, long-term flexibility.
The language changed immediately. At first, the changes were subtle. Production continued. Workers kept their jobs. The beer tasted the same. But the language surrounding the brewery shifted. Tumwater was no longer discussed in terms of heritage, permanence. It was discussed in terms of utilization, output, redundancy. Two worlds, incompatible. Inside Tumwater, the brewery was still understood as a commitment to workers, to the town, to the water that made the beer possible. Inside corporate offices, it was understood as infrastructure, something that could be optimized, consolidated, eliminated if circumstances required. These perspectives were not merely different, they were incompatible.
Ownership changed again and again. Each transition pulled Olympia further from its origins. With every sale, the brewery became more abstract. Its identity reduced to intellectual property. The brand name retained value. The physical plant did not. In fact, its very specificity, its dependence on location, workforce, water, made it less attractive in a system that prized interchangeability. Investment patterns reflected the shift. Long-term upgrades postponed. Expansion no longer discussed seriously. Maintenance kept the plant functional, but nothing more. The brewery was no longer being prepared for the next generation. It was being kept viable until a decision could be made.
For workers, uncertainty replaced permanence. Jobs still existed, but the sense of permanence was gone. Conversations about the future became cautious, then evasive. Management spoke in generalities. Plans were framed as under review. The idea that the Tumwater plant could one day close, a notion that would once have been unthinkable, entered the realm of possibility. Once closure becomes an option, survival is no longer guaranteed. The true cost of selling Olympia. The brewery had not been shut down, but it had been unanchored. Without ownership rooted in Tumwater, there was no longer any structural reason for the plant to exist indefinitely. Its survival now depended on comparative advantage within a corporate network, not on its relationship to the town it had built.
The beer could be brewed elsewhere. The brand could travel. The town could not. By the late 1990s, Olympia still operated, but it no longer controlled its own destiny. The forces that would eventually close the brewery were already in motion, embedded in the logic of consolidation and efficiency. The outcome had not yet been announced, but the decision-making framework that made that outcome inevitable was firmly in place. Olympia had not collapsed. It had been converted from a local institution into a movable asset. And once that conversion was complete, the brewery's future was no longer a question of loyalty, quality, history. It was a question of numbers. By the early 2000s, the Tumwater Brewery existed in a state of suspended certainty. Production continued, but no one spoke about the future with confidence. The small signs. In the months leading up to 2003, rumors circulated quietly. Workers noticed. Positions left unfilled. Projects postponed. Decisions delayed without explanation. Management meetings grew shorter. Communication became careful, measured, stripped of commitment. By the early 2000s, the Tumwater Brewery existed in a state of suspended certainty. Production continued, but no one spoke about the future with confidence. The small signs. In the months leading up to 2003, rumors circulated quietly. Workers noticed. Positions left unfilled. Projects postponed. Decisions delayed without explanation. Management meetings grew shorter. Communication became careful, measured, stripped of commitment. The absence of information became information. The logic was never hidden. Consolidation required fewer facilities. Centralized plants elsewhere could produce Olympia beer at lower cost. The Tumwater Brewery, tied to its geography and labor structure, could not compete on efficiency metrics alone.
In a system that valued interchangeability, its uniqueness counted against it. The announcement. When it finally came, it arrived without ceremony. The brewery will close. Production will cease. The Tumwater plant will no longer be used. There was no suggestion that the beer itself was failing. There was no accusation of mismanagement. The explanation was purely structural. The plant no longer fits the company's long-term strategy.
How the words landed. For the people who worked there, the words landed heavily, and then spread slowly, as if their meaning took time to register. Some had expected it. Others had not allowed themselves to believe it would actually happen. Olympia had survived too much for too long to simply end this way. Or so they thought. The final weeks. The final weeks unfolded in a strange, restrained quiet. No protests inside the plant. No dramatic confrontations. Workers continued to show up. Shifts were completed. Equipment was cleaned and shut down in stages. The routines that had defined daily life for decades were performed one last time, stripped of their future. The last day. On the last day of production, there was no public countdown, no cameras, no speeches. The final batch was brewed, processed, and finished like any other. When it was complete, nothing followed it.
The tanks were emptied. The lines were powered down. The constant industrial sound that had filled the brewery for generations faded into absence. The silence was immediate and unsettling. Workers gathered their personal belongings, lockers emptied, boots carried out, notes left behind. Some paused to look back at the spaces they had spent most of their adult lives in. Others left quickly, unwilling to mark the moment any more than necessary. Outside, Tumwater Falls continued to roar, unchanged by the decision that had just ended the relationship between water and work. Hundreds of jobs disappeared at once. For many employees, the brewery had not been just employment. It had been inheritance. Parents had worked here. Grandparents had worked here. Skills had been passed down alongside family stories. With the closure, that lineage stopped. There was no equivalent place to carry it forward. Official statements emphasized continuity. Olympia beer will still be brewed. The brand will continue. The implication, nothing essential had been lost. But for Tumwater, everything essential was gone. The factory that anchored the town's economy, identity, rhythm had been removed in a single administrative act.
What made the closure particularly final, there was no recourse, no appeal to local ownership, no negotiation grounded in community impact. Those levers had disappeared years earlier when control left Tumwater. The decision was executed, not debated. The outcome was not contested. It was implemented. In 2003, Olympia Brewing Company did not go bankrupt, collapse publicly, fail at making beer. The beer survived. The brand survived. What did not survive was the place that made Olympia what it was. The Tumwater Brewery did not end in fire or ruin. It ended in quiet efficiency. And in that quiet, a century-long relationship between industry and community was severed, without fanfare, without ceremony, and without return. Once the gates closed, there was no next chapter for the factory itself, only for the name it left behind.
After 2003, Olympia did not vanish from store shelves. That fact confused many people. And for those who had worked at the Tumwater Brewery, it cut especially deep. The cruel truth. The name survived. The label survived. To the outside world, Olympia appeared unchanged. But inside Tumwater, everyone understood the truth immediately.
What survived was not the brewery. It was only the brand. Production moved. The water changed. Production was moved to other facilities, first regionally, then farther away. The beer was brewed with treated water, standardized to meet corporate specifications. From a technical standpoint, this was entirely acceptable. Modern brewing no longer depended on unique geography. Water chemistry could be adjusted, flavor could be replicated, consistency could be guaranteed by machines rather than by place.
But Olympia had never been just a technical product. For more than a century, the brewery's identity had been inseparable from Tumwater itself. The slogan, "It's the water," was not poetic branding. It was a literal description of how and why this beer existed. The water flowing through the plant came from the same geological system that fed Tumwater Falls. It shaped the taste, it shaped the process, it shaped the story. When brewing left Tumwater, that connection was severed. What replaced it was abstraction. Olympia became something that could exist anywhere and nowhere at the same time, no longer tied to a river, no longer tied to a workforce, no longer tied to a town. It was tied to licensing agreements, production schedules. The name remained familiar, but its meaning became hollowed out. For long-time drinkers, something felt off, even if they couldn't articulate why. Flavor could be replicated. Consistency could be guaranteed by machines rather than by place.
For former workers, the disconnect was impossible to ignore. They watched as a product they had spent decades making continued to generate revenue. In places they had never seen. For companies they had never worked for. Using processes they did not recognize. Their labor had built the reputation. Their town had given the beer its story. But neither the labor nor the town benefited from what came next.
This is the moment when a factory truly dies. Not when the doors close, but when its output is separated from its origin. The physical contradiction. The brewery site itself stood as a physical contradiction. The buildings remained intact. The tanks, the pipes, the bottling lines, everything was still there. In theory, production could resume at any time, but without ownership rooted in Tumwater, there was no reason for it to. The plant existed in limbo, preserved but functionless. Like a museum, no one had officially declared. The first impact was economic. The deeper damage was psychological. Workers who had spent 20 or 30 years inside the brewery suddenly found themselves displaced in midlife. Their skills were highly specific: brewing systems, bottling lines, maintenance routines unique to this plant. Retraining meant starting over, often at lower wages in industries with less security. Some adapted, others retired early. Many left the area entirely, taking their experience and history with them. Local businesses felt the loss immediately. Bars that once served brewery workers after late shifts closed earlier. Restaurants saw fewer regulars. Small service shops, auto repair, dry cleaners, corner stores lost customers they'd relied on for decades. None of these closures made national headlines, but together they reshaped daily life.
The brewery complex, a presence defined by absence. It was too large to ignore and too quiet to understand. From the outside, it still looked like an industrial engine waiting to restart. Inside, dust settled on equipment designed for constant motion. Hallways that once echoed with footsteps became empty. The building stood as a reminder that Tumwater's past had been halted, not concluded. Redevelopment plans that never quite worked. City leaders and developers spoke of opportunity, mixed-use spaces, offices, cultural centers. Some plans were ambitious, others were vague. All shared the same limitation:
None could recreate what the brewery had been. You can repurpose buildings. You cannot easily replace an economic and social anchor that defined a town for generations.
A complicated relationship with the site. For residents, this created conflicting emotions. Some wanted it preserved, a monument to industrial heritage. Others wanted it erased, a painful reminder of what had been lost. Both reactions reflected the same truth. The brewery was not just a structure, it was memory, labor, and identity embedded in concrete and steel. Tumwater's younger generation grew up differently. Without the brewery as a default path, ambition turned outward: college, relocation, careers elsewhere. The town continued to exist, but its role shifted. Quieter, more residential, less defined by production, more defined by proximity to larger urban centers. This transition was not unique. Across America, towns built around a single factory face similar futures once that factory disappears. The pattern repeated with remarkable consistency: loss of stable employment, population decline or stagnation, a lingering sense of betrayal directed at decisions made far away by people who would never see the consequences. Tumwater survived. It adapted. But survival is not the same as continuity. Something essential had been removed, and no amount of adaptation could fully replace it. The relationship between place and purpose had been broken. The water still flowed over the falls, unchanged by human economics, but the system that once harnessed that water to create work, identity, pride, was gone. And without it, Tumwater became something else, not ruined, but incomplete. What remained was a town learning how to live after its reason for being had been taken away. The fall of the Olympia Brewery was never just about beer. It was about a way of organizing American industry that once tied production to place, responsibility to people. Olympia did not collapse because it failed to innovate or consumers stopped drinking. Olympia collapsed because the system that valued regional strength, local control, continuity was replaced by one that valued scale, flexibility, distance above all else. The social contract that died. For most of the 20th century, factories like Olympia functioned as social contracts. They asked workers for loyalty, skill. In return, they offered stability, wages, a future rooted in a specific place. That contract was imperfect, but it was real. When production was local, consequences were local. Decisions made in the factory affected the town immediately. Leadership could not ignore that reality. By the end of the century, that contract had been quietly dissolved. Modern corporate logic did not ask, "Does this factory matter to a town?" It asked, "Does this factory matter to the balance sheet?" If production could be moved elsewhere at lower cost, it would be. If a brand could survive without its origin, it would. Responsibility became abstract. Accountability became optional. The cost was concentrated. The benefits were dispersed. When the brewery closed, the loss was concentrated entirely in Tumwater. Jobs gone. Community anchor removed. Identity erased. The benefits of consolidation were dispersed, shared among owners, shared among investors, shared among consumers who might never know where the beer once came from. What was lost? The brewery mattered not because it was efficient, but because it was embedded. It created meaning precisely because it could not be moved. It depended on a specific river, a specific workforce, a specific town. Those constraints were not weaknesses. They were what gave the brewery identity. When those constraints were eliminated,
Identity vanished with them.
Today, the ruins of the Tumwater Brewery stand as a quiet reminder of this shift. They do not accuse, they do not demand, they simply exist, asking a question the modern economy prefers not to answer. What do communities owe to the industries that build them, and what do industries owe in return? Olympia did not fail. It was replaced by a model that no longer recognized place as a value. That model delivered cheaper beer, broader distribution, consistent flavor. It also delivered towns without anchors, workers without inheritances, brands without homes.